wish I was special. You're so very special. But I'm a creep. I'm a widow. What the hell am I doing here?
All right, and welcome to this episode of The Underside of Power. This is Mark.
And I'm Sean, and we're returning after the longest break we've taken so far.
Super long hiatus, about 6 months, not for no reason, it should be noted. We both had pretty busy summers, I would say, and then work catches up with you, but now we're back, and so let's touch on that.
Yeah.
Let's start with your summer adventures first, because you got to take a trip to the Ukraine as a part of some of your work at your
Well,
school.
technically Ukraine, but yes.
And how did that, what did you do there? How did it go? What did you like about it?
Well, I've kind of been lucky, but almost like too busy because of it. I've been lucky to travel a lot the last few months, and the coolest place I went to, the only place off of North American continent I went to was Ukraine this summer in June, and it made it really special because I'd never been overseas. I'd never been to any part of Europe, so we flew through Poland and got to Ukraine and stayed there for 7 days, and it was really fascinating and kind of beyond all of my expectations. And here I am now, a few months later, trying to learn Ukrainian and trying to plan a way to go back to that country. So.
So it really left that much of an impact on you that you were keen to return and potentially do some work. Which is surprising to me because you're not the son of a up and coming provincial or presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. So,
Yeah, I'm.
so I'm wondering what business you could be doing in Ukraine that's not utterly totally corrupt.
Yeah, I mean, I I guess I'm no Hunter Biden, but what what I find really fascinating about Ukraine is it's. I mean, I think people know that Ukraine's not stable, and there's something kind of fascinating about the level of autonomy they have now with choosing the kind of future that's going to unfold politically in that country and I guess in Eastern Europe, and the role they have to play in some of the most important kind of geopolitical up and coming events of the next few decades is huge, and they seem to know it. They pay close attention. They know their current events. The people that we worked with were students in political science who were obviously nerds about political goings on as much as I am, and it was really quite a privilege and a pleasure to get the scoop on what they think about their country and its future, and kind of get a feel for what Ukraine is really, and what a Ukrainian person is. And by the way, there's a lot of variety there. Um, I keep saying after coming back, I think Ukraine is a country that doesn't really know as a whole which path it wants to take or where it wants to go.
Seems to be a bit of a common theme. They have a new president now, who is also the subject of the thing that we mentioned before with Hunter Biden and impeachment. But we're not going to focus on that today because if I'm going to crawl willingly into a rat's nest, I want to make sure that I'm properly equipped. But the thing that was interesting about this fellow, what was his name? All I know about him really is
Zelensky?
that yes, all I know about him really was that he was a late night comedian who played a president on TV.
That's pretty much how he's known internationally. Whenever people talk about him that I know, that's usually one of the first things that comes up.
And was there any, did, of all the people that you spoke to, what was the sense that you got about his sort of like, were people
Ooh.
approving of what he was doing? Was it indifference? Did it really depend on who you talked to?
It's a good question. I was like the vast majority of my time was spent with people who study politics as students and people who teach about it as professors at two of the largest universities in Ukraine. So maybe their view is different than the general public. I would have to wait and see. But They were somewhat critical of Zelensky. I think one of the main things I heard a lot from them is that Zelensky's English and Ukrainian skills are severely lacking as he's a Russian speaker, and a lot of that counts against him in modern day Ukraine ever since the Euromaidan protests, the anti-Russian, pro-European protests. It's kind of maybe surprising to see a Russian-speaking president.
And in that, though, because of course a lot of people talk about those protests that came about and how it led to the disposition of the previous president of Ukraine, who ended up fleeing to Russia actually through Crimea. But my understanding was is that there are legitimate divides in Ukraine between those who are more loyal to sort of the Russian Federation side of things and those who are leaning more towards the European side of things.
Yeah, and I think that divide is real because we had Yanukovych, the one that you just referred to, who was ousted. Then you had Poroshenko, who was relatively, pro-European, and now we have Zelensky, and some people accuse him of being maybe more pro-Russian. So there's certainly a push and pull, and I think although there definitely is that divide that you just described, the Russian propaganda efforts, they've been exacerbating the separatist side of that. So I think there is a real contention over this, but I think Russia is trying to exaggerate the side that wishes to separate or wishes to allow, you know, to give over Ukrainian autonomy to Russia.
Yeah, and my understanding was is that there was legitimate, never minding the Crimea affair, because that was obviously a self-contained incident in of itself. But just looking at like what's occurring in the eastern reaches, like in Donetsk, for instance, that they are being equipped and supported probably through some sort of back channel arrangement. But my understanding was
Yep.
that it was pretty uncontroversial to comment that yeah, they are receiving support from the east.
Yeah, I think Vice has something called Selfie Wars or something like that. It's a documentary on YouTube, like an hour long. Something to do with like social media wars or something. And it's a little bit of an investigation on how many of those rebels are backed by Russians and how many are Russian themselves, and of course the Russians arming them. So this is the real thing that Ukrainians point to when they complain about Russian intervention in this whole movement. The Russians are definitely, you can essentially guarantee that they're backing the separatist forces in Donetsk and in Luhansk.
Interesting. So I guess it was a pretty good trip overall. You seem to have quite a feel for the on the ground just from the short time that you were there.
Tak duże dobre.
So, and what's interesting about all this is because I had an opportunity to do some traveling this summer as well, and I got to visit Russia, in fact. I went with my partner to visit her parents. We met them in Moscow. We stayed there for about a day, went to St. Petersburg. We came back and we went to a town, I think it's a city actually, called Sergeyev Prasad, which is part of the Golden Ring in the Russian Orthodox tradition. And then we went back to their hometown of Volgograd, which was the former Stalingrad.
Hmm.
Um, and it's kind of interesting that you talk about like this international perspective on the country and some of their dealings outside. Because when you're inside of the country, at least from my experience, and like I was there as a tourist and I was there with locals, and so you often question like this isn't this obviously is not the lived experience of everyone there. But it is a remarkable country in a lot of ways. I think there's a very good reason why they they being I guess the Russians and I suppose the Soviets sort of before them contemporarily. It's a hard distinction. There's a very good reason why they were such potent adversaries, and it's because they are, from my understanding, there's two sides of it, right? There's sort of like the industrial civic side of things, and then there's sort of the hospitality and tourism side of things. And at least while I was there, like you could see both very clearly. I mean, I spent a very small amount of time in Moscow, and I have to say that between the Kremlin and the metro, we went to the Tsaritsina Gardens in the south that were actually
The metro
cons-
is amazing
it is. Yeah, I'll
because
touch on that in a moment.
Ukraine's metro was also built by the Soviets. So
Yeah, it makes sense. Well, of course, right? And I'll touch on that in a moment. But like the Tsaritsina Gardens in the south was actually what's interesting about sort of the Russian monarchy in its imperial time was that each one of the rulers built sort of their own palaces and castles. So this was an area that was built for Catherine the Great. But it was
Huh.
never completed, and she died before it was ready, and it just laid abandoned for like 100 or so years or longer, and then they came back and rebuilt it fairly recently actually. And it was just the thing that when you were, from my understanding, each emperor and monarch and whatnot had their own constructions to them, and the history is just everywhere. And just focusing on Moscow for the moment, well, you mentioned the metro, and it is like an actual work of art, just from a design perspective and just the coverage of such a huge city.
That's the
You're
crazy
talking,
part.
yeah, you're talking about a city of like the estimates between 14 to 17 million, depending on the year and who you count.
Wow.
um like gigantic, right? Like just nothing that we have in our entire country compares to that. And the coverage is amazing, but what was so fascinating to me is that many of the stations and the architecture and the symbology relates to the wars of the 20th century. So of course the Second World War looms very large in their iconography.
Hmm.
The Revolution, there's actually an area called like Revolution Square, and the station there has a bunch of statuettes and whatnot in support, statues in support of, or recognizing and celebrating that time. And
So
you
so
see
statues of who?
just sort of just like a lot of it is the glorification of certain like foot soldiers and like the people who fought and stuff. So it wasn't of
Hmm.
any like specific individual, which is kind of neat. A lot of it was like very representative in its nature. And then, but the thing that you see around a lot, and this was the thing that I found really interesting, was that with Moscow, it was definitely sort of the quote unquote like Soviet capital.
Right.
The hammer and sickle symbology is everywhere. You do see
Still?
it still on the buildings. Well, of course, right? Because that's when it was built and for the country that it was built for.
Oh, yeah, there's a giant I'm gonna forget the name now. There's a giant statue in Kiev and it has the Soviet crest on the shield. And there's a debate
Hmm.
about whether to remove the crest or remove the statue or leave it. But yeah, I've seen that in Ukraine.
Yeah, and I think the argument there, from what I understand, is that it was left there because that what those were the people who built it. It was of the Soviet Empire essentially.
Right.
Um, and they were like an incredibly formidable and industrial force, right? Because like we never would have like sorry, the Americans never would have ended up on the moon if the Soviets hadn't launched Sputnik, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because at the time there was no capitalist rationale to go to space. And then the Soviets did it, and then they're like, "Oh shit,
Ah, I guess
this
that
could
kind of
be
makes
very
sense.
bad for us."
That's kind of like a very like centrally planned kind of thing to happen.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to give them credit where credit is due. Were like were there some, how shall we say, undesirable outcomes associated with that? Well,
Like
yeah, but same
starvation, genocide, imprisonment.
yeah, same with any empire, including the American empire. Um, and so, like if Yemen is any indication of how an empire can facilitate genocide, right? So it's one of those things where you look at the products of that time, and when you sort of like put it on balance, and you go like whether you were in support or not, it was formidable. And there's so much more to talk about, like with like the Kremlin, and oh, this was something really funny about Moscow actually. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Maybe actually what we will do is I'll come back to this on a later episode because we have another thing to discuss. But the one thing I just wanted to mention on
Yeah,
Moscow,
because I
and then
barely
maybe I'll
scratched the surface on Ukraine too, so that's maybe a good idea.
yeah, yeah, exactly. The one thing about Moscow that was probably one of my most interesting parts. Now, of course, you have like the big cathedrals there, in the big cathedral in the Red Square by the Kremlin and everything. Just incredible. But what was interesting is that there's a store called Goom on the Red Square, and it was like sort of the universal government store for a long time. Before that, it was actually built by Russian aristocracy for, I don't exactly remember the purpose, but I guess it was like a ritzy store. Then it was converted by the Soviets into this like universal market type thing, and now it has been reattributed by capital for, it has like a Louis Vuitton outlet and like Prada and all these like super luxe brands. And what's fascinating though is that that is on one side of the Red Square, and on the other side of the Red Square is the mausoleum for Lenin.
that's that's pretty wild.
So it's interesting, right? Because you have, and this is a thing that I don't think that a lot of, especially people in Canada, I don't think that they understand. Many people don't understand, who haven't been away, like what it means to be in a place where there's like a force of history there. That is absolutely a place with a force of history. Oh, and also
Oh
Russian
yeah,
cuisine.
100%.
Just Russian cuisine is also the bomb.
Oh
They
yeah,
they
yeah.
they
Ukrainian food's
totally,
incredible.
yeah, they totally blow us out of the water because it's like our food has like tons of like simple sugar in it, tons of glucose, fructose, sucrose, that kind of shit. But theirs is like a lot of their food, and it's not like, to try and generalize would be impossible, but they a lot of it is like sort of like fat based, like there's a lot of like really heavy creams and like very full cheeses and stuff that are involved, and there's just, we just don't have anything like that. It's fantastic.
I was also gonna say, going around this about 1,500-year-old city, Kiev, for a week was, yeah. When you mention the weight of history, you can definitely feel it in a city like Kiev. Like there's all these like layers of different centuries of architecture, like all behind one another, and it's really
Mhm.
fast. There's cobblestone and all these walking areas where a car wouldn't really be able to fit, and it's just fascinating.
Funnily enough, Kiev is actually one of the hero cities of the Second World War. Is actually celebrated with a monument in both Moscow and Volgograd.
Yeah, I believe it. I bet you the well, I mean, there's so much to say there, but I bet you the Russians still somewhat think Kiev should be theirs.
And I think that that argument isn't entirely frivolous. I think that there is a case to be made that there is a shared heritage there, but that's not for us to untangle
It's the
here.
whole Kievan Rus history, right? So,
Yes, yes, it's very complicated, and yeah, it is probably not worth engaging in. But I still have so much more to talk about like St. Petersburg and Volgograd and Sergei Prasad. And interestingly, my partner's father has done some work on a lot of monuments in the area, so I want to touch on that as well. But that's another time. We have things closer to home and bigger fish to fry, and I think that
yeah.
brings us to the topic of this week's episode.
So I think I've always paid attention to provincial politics, but never as much in the last year or so. I think towards the end of the NDP's term and the beginning of the UCP's is when I've really started paying close attention, and I never realized how truly fascinating it is. So we're going through quite a few of the top kind of provincial issues and stories today, for Alberta, around especially the budget.
Right. And so I think that I mean, of course, we talked about the election in one of our earlier episodes and sort of leading up to it in some of our demos. But following the election of the UCP, we knew that two things were going to happen. Corporate taxes were going to be cut, and then public services were going to be cut. But we weren't exactly sure how that was going to break down, what the justifications were going to be, how this was going to play out, right? And the first thing that, well, actually, before all of this, they announced their the what was it, the job creation tax cut, they called it,
Yeah, that was
which
pre-budget essentially.
was pre-budget, and essentially was, so over 4 years it's a 4.7 billion dollar tax giveaway. That's the first thing that they did pretty much, other than repeal the carbon tax.
I remember when I was on the plane home. So I was on vacation in the States when they won the election, and on the plane ride home, I was reading about the tax cut and calculating what it was going to be over 4 years.
Yeah. So pretty massive, pretty extensive. And then following that, I think the next big item was the McKinnon report, or the Blue Ribbon Panel report. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I mean, I might as well. I think that just really quick, when it comes to the corporate tax rate cut, it's important to mention this is kind of We can kind of trace the lineage from the United States with a policy like this. I think that it's inspired by people like Ronald Reagan and ideas of neoliberalism. I really think this is quite like a Reagan era policy. This is literally a trickle down type of economic policy. So, when it comes to the UCP's fiscal policy, I think they're kind of taking a page out of the book of Republican austerity. Which is worth noticing. But yeah, the
And
McKinnon report it's almost insignificant now, so we won't spend too much time on it. Simply because we now know what the budget looks like, at least for the upcoming year, the current fiscal year, I suppose. But the McKinnon report is worth talking about when it comes to the strategy that it played in the United Conservative Party's fiscal planning, and maybe worth talking about some of the errors that are within that report.
yeah, and I think that the important thing to note as well. So it's funny you brought up Reagan, and one of his vice presidents was George H.W. Bush, Bush the older. And do you know what
Daddy
he
Bush,
called do you know what he Daddy Bush? Do you know what he called trickle down economics?
voodoo economics.
Voodoo economics, that's right. So yeah, and that you said about the Blue Ribbon panel report, the McKinnon report, is that it's not worth really focusing in on in of itself. It's a long document. It's intentionally obfuscates a lot of information. I have often said that it's almost a bit of a fraud and not really worth the paper that it's written
It's
on.
almost an intentionally misleading report.
Yeah, it's almost as if it was made to justify the policies that it would then go on to inform. It's almost as if the policies were prepared first, and this report was designed to try and launder them, essentially. And I just want to point out, I think it would be good before continuing on, just to point out some of the core issues with the Blue Ribbon Panel report, just to kind of, because I think these are things that are going to come up time and time again in this strategy of using panels and consultation and reports to really just wash these sort of like very strong, like far right wing economic policies of any wrongdoing is what they're attempting to do.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Because I think they rely on the strength of the report being independent, and they rely on that as being perceived as nonpartisan. I think that's a key strategy that's being used here.
right. And so just to point out some of the issues, and this comes up quite frequently in the UCP's rhetoric and comparisons and economic justifications, including in the fiscal report, the budget that came out. And so just to bear in mind with the Blue Ribbon Panel, the choice of comparisons for provinces that they used, they chose BC and Ontario and Quebec rather rather specifically and intentionally because BC and Ontario are some of the lowest per capita spending provinces of our federation, right? They also included Quebec because Quebec is also just very large and there's this whole idea of like the economies of scale thing going on. But bear in mind they chose BC and they chose Ontario because they do spend less than the Canadian average.
Right, yeah, and I think when you're choosing those, and especially including Ontario and Quebec as the two in your analysis, which by population standards are not even comparable to Alberta in any scenario, what you're doing there is you're stacking the deck against us in terms of um, it's virtually guaranteeing a recommendation to make cuts if you're making a comparison in this way. You're essentially um, expecting to get a result that says you need to make cuts or do some kind of fiscal spending reduction if you're comparing to these three provinces.
Right, and like for instance, why wasn't Saskatchewan included? They're very similar prairie province with, resource-based economies, including oil. And the reason why they didn't compare to Saskatchewan is Saskatchewan actually spends slightly more per capita than Alberta does, owing to a strong tradition of social democratic institutions put forth by Tommy Douglas a long time ago. So those effects are still felt today.
Yeah, yeah, and if I might read off of the Parkland Institute, the other issue not only is there economies of scale in larger provinces, not only are Ontario and BC some of the lowest spenders in the Federation, if not the lowest, it's important to remember the kind of economic differences in Alberta as opposed to other provinces. Economically, and in terms of inflation, we're very different from other provinces. The Parkland Institute, if I might just read this, they said that a limitation of the reports is the focus on a single year of data that is not necessarily representative of long term trends. In 2016, the economy was still in recession in Alberta. Private sector wages were declining. And furthermore, the Notley government pursued counter cyclical policies during the recession, which included maintaining and expanding the public sector. Um, so the point is, the years that they used were not representative of the longer term situation in Alberta's public sector. And finally, and this is the really critical part, the Alberta economy experienced larger than average rates of inflation over the period since 2000. Thus, using nominal earnings comparisons between provinces will yield distorted results. So, over the last, almost 20 years, our inflation rates make us completely incomparable with with BC, Ontario, and Quebec.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too bogged down in the issues with the report because we have so much more to go over with the budget. But yeah, there's never any control for the numbers in what are called real terms, which is a combination of inflation and population increase metrics to help even out the data. And yes, Alberta was subjected to periods of hyperinflation relative to the rest of Canada. So, for instance, I looked up the Canada Tax Whatever Institute website, and they have an inflation calculator there. When you compare us versus Ontario from 1990 to now, so a period of 29 years, our inflation on average has been around 8.7% higher than Ontario's and closer to
Whew.
10% higher than the Canadian average over the same time.
Right, so if you
And
don't control for those, you can intentionally make it look like we're spending more than we actually are.
yeah, because our dollar doesn't go as far. And actually, funnily enough, that had to do with very specific policies from the governments that came before, including allowing people to take home more and more percentage of their income with like the 10% flat tax, for instance, which allowed people to spend far more into the economy and therefore drive up the costs. Which of course now we're left with the legacy of that. Also, the issue with not taking in proper royalty revenue in order to properly fund, public capital maintenance and all that kind of stuff. So there's a whole bunch of things that come in. And I suppose the other two thing, or the last thing about the report that I'm going to comment on, and then leave it to you to finish it off, was so the mandate was specifically not to look at revenues, only expenditures, as per the letter that came from the Minister of Finance, which was Minister Tays. And the report does show telltale signs of last minute editing, like just poor writing, sentences that end in propositions, conjugates, or what would you call them? I guess linker words to begin sentences like but and. I mean, it's just very like very classic, like, oh, you did this the night before it was due type of stuff. And it was because we know that it was sent to the government and the government sent it back and said, you got to fix this, this, and this because this isn't in alignment with our policy.
Right.
But the one thing that I just want to point out is that the panel does put some interesting onus on the government, and I'm just going to try and find it really quick. Here it is. Um, they say here, we have also included the impact of decisions already made by the United Conservative Party government that have had an impact on revenues, specifically the reduction in the corporate income tax rate, elimination of the carbon tax, and a potential crude by rail divestiture, which actually, as it turns out, those decisions alone probably added about $2 billion to our deficit. So we went from 6 point whatever billion dollars to 8 point whatever billion dollars of deficit just in the first half of this year.
Right, yeah. I mean, that's important to mention that the deficit's actually going to be higher this year than last year by about 2 billion. But yeah, I think you touched on everything important. The last thing I want to say on the report is just that revenues were not focused on. I think this is also maybe something that came as part of the. Well, I think it's been confirmed that this is part of the McKinnon like working group or committee. It was part of their mandate to not look at revenues. So we've got them kind of ignoring the corporate tax cut, kind of ignoring the other things that hurt our revenue, like getting out of that rail deal, and they've also ignored the possibility of looking at revenue increases to balance our budgets.
Yeah, it really is just I was trying to figure out a way to put it diplomatically, but I just don't have it in me.
It's just silly. That's what it is.
So
I
yeah,
mean,
it's just silly. Yeah,
it's
it's just silliness. It's just it's like just classic like economic bungling that just doesn't make any sense.
yeah. It seems like a lot of conclusions before the arguments were made for them. How do you say that? Like they decided on their point before they thought about it, kind of thing, and they did all their
Uh,
justification after the fact.
Preconceived notion.
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah. So yeah, it's really fascinating, and I think it wouldn't be so bad if the party wasn't so smug about it and going out on all of their usual channels to like blast the NDP, to blast Trudeau, who need I remind everyone was the leader of the government that bought them the Trans Mountain Extension pipeline. Um, and when you look at all that and then combined with like sort of their record just over the last, never mind the 44 years that the PCs were in power, just the last 5 months. And you look at that and you go, I really feel like we're just kind of doing it to ourselves, to be honest with you. Um, yeah.
Well, yeah, but to be fair to the voters, I think Kenny's done a pretty marvelous job of deflecting and blaming things on Trudeau. Like with Encana, for example, he immediately jumped on the Trudeau didn't do the pipeline kind of talking point thing, and he was all over that. When really, I I I, I don't know. It just seems like his policy with the corporate tax cut, if it really was going to work the way he said it was going to work, then Encana would have been fine and they would have stayed, and Husky would have been fine and they wouldn't have done layoffs. But then all that gets blamed on Trudeau. Like it seems like it's more of a failure of his own policy than a court decision over a pipeline that Trudeau had nothing to do with.
And not only that, but actually the PCs and the Conservative Party of Canada government under Stephen Harper when he still had a majority, they really my understanding was is that they really dragged the feet on putting in the proposals for the regulatory processes for these pipelines, and that alone actually lost them like the TMX and other planned extensions and the Northern Gateway as well because they actually like they my understanding with the Northern Gateway for instance is that they literally did not approve of the land use with many of the parties involved, and that's actually why it got stopped. And that's actually why now you see with a lot of the pipeline stuff, they always talk about, oh well, we're going to consult with Indigenous people, and we're going to give them shares and a place within the process, kind of thing, and we're going to make sure that they have access to some of the economic output. All of that language is directly related to the failures of the PC government in Alberta and the CPC government in Ottawa under Harper. So be on the lookout for that. So
Yeah, yeah, and I guess just on the McKinnon report, last thing I would say is that we've seen a kind of a theme of fudging numbers recently to get the outcomes that they want, presuming their conclusions and kind of making the facts work around that. And I think post-secondary is another example of that with the way that the cuts were calculated. So do you want to get right
yeah.
into the budget, the real deal of what we heard in terms of our fiscal policy in Alberta for the next little bit?
Um, do I want to or do I need to?
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of painful to talk about since I've been dealing with it every day for the last little bit. But yeah, constantly keeping up on it is exhausting. But I think you're right. It's kind of like worthwhile, necessary, but painful.
Very painful. So I guess that starts with post-secondary education.
Yeah,
So
like kind of a blatant attack we see coming from the budget on post secondary in three different big ways that I've noticed.
right, and I think that so the numbers that we have here is that so the $5.1 billion advanced education budget is down 5% from current spending levels and aims to cut post-secondary spending by a total of 12.5% to 4.8 billion over the next 4 years. So this is quite a substantial hit. It's sort of done under this guise of, spending more on education doesn't necessarily yield better results, that there are inefficiencies and bloat within the post-secondary system that need to be dealt with, which may or may not be true depending on which institution you're talking about. And then the whole idea that, we need accountability to the taxpayer. And but the funny thing is though is that we also hear language that, our post-secondary education should remain affordable and accessible. Alberta does have the worst post-secondary education participation rate out of any of the provinces, and this is made worse when you look at the numbers of people in rural communities who pursue post-secondary education, in which case I don't have the specific number here, but it's very, very low. So that accessibility and affordability is a big part, which kind of makes some of these policies very strange to me.
Yeah, it's pretty troublesome that we're going to see accessibility, I would say, severely threatened by the fiscal policy around post-secondary. I think accessibility, I think there's a danger of them pricing themselves out of the market in their post-secondary education. I think there's a danger of people who are midway through the degrees trying to transfer to other provinces. Um, yeah, I mean, I think there's a chance at a student exodus, maybe in a small way. Um, I wouldn't suggest that there's going to be a large number of universities closing or anything like that, but I wouldn't be surprised if enrollment does go down.
And I think that more to the point is that part of the reason why, so the tuition increase specifically, which is what we should start with. So
Yeah, do you want to
before,
outline maybe the three main kind of the triple threat of financial burdens now being placed on students?
yeah, I can do that. So the thing is that before, so under the previous government, the NDP government, there was a piece of legislation passed called Bill 19, and it was an amendment to the Post-Secondary Learning Act. It did some interesting things. So for one, it froze tuition for domestic students. That tuition freeze was going to end this year anyway, but then every year afterwards, the domestic tuition could only increase at the rate of the consumer price index, which is a measure of inflation, every year. So that could shift depending on where in the institution you increase tuitions, up to a maximum of 10% for any given program. However, exceptional increases to tuition above 10% and the introduction of new mandatory non-instructional fees, which were also uh, banned under that piece of legislation, could only be introduced with explicit joint approval of the relevant student governance body, which is kind of a cool piece of legislation in my opinion. I think that's a very good model for going about
Yeah,
it.
that was a fascinating safeguard where if they wanted to raise tuition above the max, so I believe it was there was the CPI, there was tying to CPI, but then there was also a max. For example, if CPI went up too much that year, there was a max after which it wouldn't increase the CPI. And if you wanted to go above either of those two provisions, you had to get the Students Association or Students Union to sign off on that decision.
Exactly. And the thing is that there weren't really as many. That was for like domestic students specifically. For international students, no such protections were offered, other than the introduction of a new framework where a university or a college or whatever institution needs to present the full upfront cost of the degree to the student before they sign on, which then the institution has to legally honor and cannot increase the tuition while they are attending school or attending the university. So so that's interesting. That only affects international students who are coming in. International students who are already here literally have zero protections under the current legislation. So that's sort of the most recent background. Like in short, it's a little more complicated than that, but that's the brief.
So, with that provision in Bill 19 that allows for student associations to sign off on tuition increases, is that going to stick around then?
So Yes, theoretically, for any exceptional increases over 10%. But the thing with what this new budget and the accompanying legislation to help implement it, that increase, that minimum, or sorry, maximum increase that can occur as a average across an entire institution is now 7%, with no individual program increasing by more than 10% without consultation with the relevant student body. So what this essentially means is that over 3 years, it's a 7% increase every year. So it's somewhere between 21 and 23% overall. And then after that, it will be capped to CPI. Depending on the program, this is an additional $800 to $1,200 per year in tuition by the end of the increases.
Wow, and I know I kind of framed it as a triple threat. You know about the other two parts of the financial burden that we're talking about, right? It's not just tuition.
Yeah, and so this was the one that really got stuck in my chips
Yeah, this is the
because
one that shocked me, frankly.
yeah, so it was the elimination of the two different student tax credits that we had in Alberta. And so the first one, which was a tuition tax credit, is calculated as 10% of your tuition cost. So you get to write off 10% of what you put into tuition per year off of your taxes or off of your parents' taxes if they're paying for your schooling. So, depending on the program, this can be up to $1,000 per year per student. And then the other one was the student tax, or sorry, the other was the enrollment credit, which was you got $75 per month of study for full-time students off of your taxes. So it came out to between $600 to $650 depending on how many months you were in school. For part-time students, it was about $22 a month. So in combination for a full-time student, the impact could be anywhere between like $1,400 to around 2 grand per year
And
in economic impact.
even when you average it between part-time and full-time students, we still end up with over 1,000 per year per student in what is essentially a tax hike.
Yes, and part of the rationale for this one is saying this was a very generous program. We can't afford it now, and we need. There's actually the part that made me angry was that in the budget document that was released, there was a two-paragraph justification for the elimination of these credits. And I think that, and so what they say is like, oh, and this is comparable to Ontario and Saskatchewan, which are also governments that are being run by far right-wing, fiscal conservative and socially conservative parties right now.
Mm-hmm.
Although maybe less so in Ontario. I don't think it's fair to call the Ontario PC socially conservative. But that is interesting to me. And I think what this actually is I think they're literally just wiping the tax code so that they can rebuild it as they see fit.
Yeah, well, essentially, this is just part of the larger de-indexing. But let's get to the third thing, the triple threat. One is tuition, two is taxes, and third is interest rate on your provincial student loans.
Yeah, 1% increase, prime plus 1% on your provincial student loans. Now, it has been justified that this is synchronized with a 1% decrease in the federal student loans, but if you only have provincial loans, like this is only bad news for you.
Yeah, so it's offset, and I know that actually even the advanced education minister has pointed to, oh, that's great that the federal government has offset us, so that now it amounts to about the same after ours has increased and theirs has decreased when they're usually so anti-Ottawa. It's really funny to see them referring to that as a good thing, as their only thing, kind of talking point saving them from this really kind of insane and I would say morally bankrupt idea to balance the budget on the backs of students.
And that's the thing that's kind of alarming with how this budget was rolled out, because the thing is that it wasn't all post-secondary institutions that took the hit. The four, I think they're semi-private religious organizations, religious universities and post-secondary institutions in the province, saw a 0% um, cut or increase to their budgets. They just kind of held standard. So it is technically still a cut, but it's 0%. So that it's not bad. But also, even though that some of the polytechnic and vocational schools also got hit with a budget cut, there was a lot of additional funding that was introduced for sort of streamlining apprenticeship programs and introducing new training opportunities for students pursuing like trades and stuff like this. And it wasn't just the Campus Alberta grant that got cut. It wasn't just the uh, interest rate hike or the tax grab. It was a tax grab. Um, but it was also that they slashed a whole bunch of other post-secondary funding, including the infrastructure maintenance plan, which cost, I think, the U of A alone something like it was like in and around like $35 million or something. That's just gone. That we need to rebuild our buildings.
At McEwen, the total cut to the infrastructure maintenance fund was equivalent to about 1/4 of the cut to the Campus Alberta grant. So it's a very large chunk of money also missing from infrastructure maintenance.
Yeah, so that's
Which,
kind of
like,
the
for
state of the post.
universities,
Oh,
infrastructure maintenance is pretty critical because enrollment for a successful university goes up constantly. They have certain faculties and departments that will grow if they become popular. It's critical that they have the ability to maintain and build new infrastructure.
well, for instance, the University of Alberta has a very extensive deferred maintenance problem. Some people hear the number 1 billion being passed around. That's $1 billion over 5 years. So it's about $200 million per year to get everything under control because it's the oldest campus. Like the buildings, like they flood, they fall apart, the pipes burst, the water in the water fountains is undrinkable. Some of the labs are very dated. There can be like mold contamination in the ducts. Some of the buildings still have asbestos in them, which is only a problem when it gets exposed because you can have it safely in the building until it's exposed. But there's lots of things that need to be addressed with that, and we will probably see decrease in student satisfaction in their education as a result, especially in those institutions that are beginning to show their age a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So overall, the cuts are pretty devastating, and kind of the two of the worst parts is that the calculation they used was based on surpluses. That was very superficial and actually punishes universities for having balanced budgets or posting surpluses, which is kind of interesting. The universities that got cut the least, other than of course the private colleges that you mentioned, the private Christian colleges, the ones that got cut the least that are public were the ones that have been posting deficits, the universities that were broke. So that's interesting. Um,
And also in Alberta, our surplus numbers sometimes, well, I think they do often include endowments, which cannot be spent on operational capacity, but are still included in the year-end financial documents. That's at least what I heard from our central administration.
Right, yeah, and the most one of the most surprising things about the way that they've reduced the Campus Alberta grant is that it is retroactive. So had they not been strategizing to help out the federal election with Andrew Scheer, they would have released their budget earlier, and then it would have made sense for it to kick in April. But they released it in after the federal election in the fall to be strategic,
October 24th.
but they still made it retroactive. So it's not that all the cuts and the changes take place from October onwards. They took place from April. Retroactive cuts for months during which universities were spending money that they did not have.
And there was a bill that was passed, which was like a interim funding bill that was a 10% decrease over like the same amount of time. So that was already taken into account, and pretty much what that meant was, at least at my institution, was the laying off of contracted trade staff as part of deferred maintenance, and that's how they managed to weather that storm.
Right, yeah.
Remember, this is a job creation tax cut.
Well, that's the funny part, right? Is that we're supposed to see a balanced budget. We're supposed to see jobs being created, but we're losing jobs. The universities are going to be bleeding jobs over the next year, 2, 3 years. We're seeing a lot of jobs being lost in oil and gas, funny enough, and we can get into that. And we're also going to see a larger deficit this year, which is a point that I can't hammer home enough because, I mean, that's just what happens when you cut taxes and frankly, can't cut spending enough to keep up. Like there's no amount of austerity that'll save us when our revenue is as shitty as it is.
So, it's all good news. It's all very rosy, just in time for the holiday season. The lights are shining, the roads aren't paved, The Tory Lecture Theatre flooded again. Great. It's fine. Don't worry about it. It's gonna be okay. The jobs are gonna come back. 55,000 jobs. It'll be great.
Yeah, so I mean, on that note, I think we kind of have two more topics that we can tackle here. I think two of the really critical things after post-secondary that come out of the budget are the rest of the de-indexing stances taken by our government, and also what you were just talking about, the tax cut to corporate tax rate, the effect that it has on jobs, the effect that has on the economy, or maybe the effect it doesn't have and didn't have when it came to companies like Encana.
Yeah, exactly. And so let's get into the de-indexing because we could talk about K to 12, but really the only thing to say is that they got no increase to their budget.
Yeah.
And what this means is actually a 14.7% cut over 4 years when you take into account population increase and inflation in light of actually a ballooning primary education wave that's coming through. There's a tsunami that is coming through the primary and secondary education system right now. It's right now at grades 3 and 4, and right now those classes are very overcrowded. And funnily enough, I suspect that that had to do with people having kids during the second boom period during the oil sands era.
Yeah, and so they're building schools, but very funny
Oh,
to me.
the NDP were building
I
schools
know,
like crazy to make up for over 20 years of neglect in the
I
system.
know. So the UCP is taking credit for those, continuing to build those, but refusing to staff them or provide the funding to increase staff in K to 12.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much all
So,
there is about K to 12. I think we can get onto the juicy bracket creep and de-indexing part of the budget, which to me is completely unacceptable, completely out of line with the UCP's mandate. It really goes against their platform and their policy.
and I don't think that we should be surprised. I mean, just so for those who may not be aware, de-indexing in the sort of tax wonkery world is a strategy of removing adjustments for specific, whether it's taxes or specific government programs. They are adjusted through time, usually by inflation, by the consumer price index. And what this means is that even if you say get a quality of life increase on your wages, which is common to keep up with inflation and to be competitive in your wages, um, your quality of life doesn't actually change. It's just keeping standard with the increased average cost of living.
Yeah,
But if you de-index taxes, what that means then is that the brackets do not change over time, even though your income very well might change over time, just to keep up with inflation. And they didn't just do this with the taxes as well. They also did this with a number of social support programs. Most notably, and I think the thing that they're receiving the most fire for, was the one for the assured income for the severely handicapped, also known as AISH, where they de indexed it, meaning that these individuals who like they cannot work. They are severely handicapped, either physically. Some of them have mental disabilities or disorders that prevent them from being able to function in a hyper capitalist social Darwin economy kind of thing. Um, and yeah, they over time those supports will erode until they may not be able to. They'll have to choose between keeping the lights on or buying food potentially.
yeah, and that's one of the really shocking bits in the budget. I don't I know a lot of these are on their own very small gains. For example, the student tax credit elimination um, only makes a couple hundred million per year. And same thing with AISH. It's a very small gain, but for the people who are receiving AISH, it's extremely large cut to their quality of life and the level of assisted income they're receiving. And the thing that really gets me about the AISH situation that is really frustrating is that you have to prove that you're unable to work to qualify for AISH. That's why it's assured income for the severely handicapped. It's people who can't work. And to tell people that can't work that you can no longer have your essentially your welfare payment tied to the consumer price index is just, it just seems inhumane. It just seems wrong. Like the vetting procedure to get onto AISH is not easy to get through. It's extremely rigorous, and I just don't get it.
It's like, oh, what's this? You're constrained to a wheelchair because of a muscular degenerative disease, probably as a result of all of the industrial toxins that we keep pumping into our groundwater in this province, and you can't work. Oh, well, now you don't even get to maintain the quality of life that you have. Thanks for playing. Try again next time.
Yeah, and so that's, I mean, in the light of the $4.7 billion corporate tax reduction over the next 4 years, that just seems completely unacceptable.
And that's the thing, even with all this de-indexing, even with all these cuts, even with these tuition increases, they still found a way to add $2 billion to the deficit.
Right, yeah, like everyone's paying more in taxes essentially. I believe it was Trevor Toom, economist from U of C.
Tombe.
Oh, that's how you say it. Okay, I've
I
read
think
his
so.
name so
That's
many
how I've heard
times.
it.
But
So I've heard it pronounced.
okay, so he calculated that the tax increase. I think when you average it among all families, it's $150 a year. But it's especially hitting middle class families, so you have to keep that in mind because he averaged it for all Alberta families. But it's just tremendous to see, tremendously disappointing and shocking and just so bewildering to see the taxes on the middle class increase under the UCP government.
And the most beautiful part about this whole de-indexing thing is that you dug up a really great example of one of our beloved leaders in the province when he was on the Parliament Hill. Do you want to touch on that? Because you told me about this, and I couldn't even like get I couldn't even work up energy about it because I just heard it and I kind of went, oh yeah, well that makes sense actually. Like no shit that they would do this. Do you want to touch on this?
Yeah, so I heard this from a professor at the U of A, and I went to go look it up myself and found the article. I I believe the one that I found is called "The Creeping Horror Alberta Never Knew It Was Voting For," essentially outlining the surprise that comes along with realizing that what Jason Kenney said in Parliament a decade or so ago, maybe 2 decades ago, is the
It was the Chrétien government that he was most critical of in this regard, I think.
Okay, yeah, I believe that makes sense. Yeah. So a few years ago, when Jason Kenney was in the Reform Party, he was very vocally opposed to de-indexing. He was very opposed to bracket creep, and I was directed to search this out by a professor at the U of A who pointed out that. And this article points out the same thing. If you go to Open Parliament and you search bracket creep, you'll find that Jason Kenney is the member of Parliament who said it the second most amount of times, with 26 utterances of bracket creep, railing against the government at the time for increasing middle class taxes by through bracket creep. So it's fascinating to see Jason Kenney's utter hypocrisy on this issue. As a Reform member of Parliament, Kenney was fundamentally, unequivocally, and unconditionally opposed to de-indexing, and he said it was an unfair increase of taxes. And now, as a government, he wants to hike taxes through the exact same kind of tricky and slimy mechanism. And I mean, you're right. It's kind of expected that this is what a lot of politicians do, and maybe it's not surprising that Jason Kenney did this. But it's at the same time it's unprincipled and it's dishonest, and I was a little bit shocked to see exactly how slimy and dishonest he was in this case.
And I think what's interesting about all this is that we commented before that there was a corporate tax cut. It's estimated now actually to be $4.7 billion, which is above the $4.5 billion that was originally reported. And I think what's interesting is that we have a Press Progress article here, who I honestly believe is like one of the last bastions of like true gumshoe style journalism in Canada, because I find anything that's owned by Post Media just like crumple it up, throw it away. don't like it's not even worth your time most of the time. So yeah, that taking shots at the Edmonton Journal and the Calgary Herald at the same time, I will secure my seat in the circles of journalism for years to come. Um, but this is an excerpt from this article, and it states here that while campaigning, the current opposition warned Kenny's corporate tax cut would blow a $4.5 billion hole in public revenues over 4 years. But reports from just five of Alberta's top companies themselves suggest the likely drop in revenue is larger than that. An analysis of Alberta's big five energy companies, which remained remarkably profitable even during the oil price crash that saw almost 20,000 workers laid off. Actually, it was a lot more than 20,000 workers that were laid off. Finds these companies alone expect to save a combined $4.277 billion thanks to the tax cut. Canadian Natural Resources expects to save the most from the tax cut, $1.618 billion. In its second quarter report, CNR told stakeholders, in the second quarter of 2019, the Government of Alberta enacted legislation that decreased the provincial corporate income tax rate from 12% to 11% effective July 1st, 2019, with further 1% rate reductions every year on January 1st until the provincial corporate income tax rate is 8% on January 1st, 2022. As a result of these corporate income tax rate reductions, the company's deferred corporate income tax liability decreased by $1,618 million. Suncor Energy, meanwhile, is projecting to save $1.116 billion.
Yeah, and jobs. We get jobs out of
Jobs?
this, right? This
We
is
got
this is.
We got jobs. I got
I
jobs for
think they're going to
days.
invest now, and they're going to hire a bunch of people, right?
They are going to trickle down the wealth. I mean, they're giving me a job because I have voluntarily started investigating all this stuff in my spare time. I am fully employed while not being paid for it at all. So that's one job related to this.
Yeah, yeah. So why don't we get into those lost jobs? I think maybe
I am the lone beneficiary.
so we all saw what happened 2 weeks ago with Encana, and maybe around the same
Yes.
time with Husky. We saw
Uh,
kind of the failure of the trickle down policy. I mean, we've seen this for a few decades in a row now. How trickle down doesn't seem to quite do what it's claimed to do, and Encana.
voodoo. It's voodoo.
Fair enough. And Canna and Husky, their decisions recently in response to their headquarters in one case and their workforce in the other, I think that's a pretty clear indication of failure.
Yeah, but you know that when you get asked about it, I remember the energy minister, Sonia Savage, responding to the Encana debacle, who has now moved to the States and rebranded themselves Ovintiv for some totally inscrutable reason. Maybe Ovintiv is like a thing that only people who drink fracking fluid can understand. Maybe that's what the goal is.
Yeah, well, they
But
couldn't be Encana anymore because it's Energy Canada.
yeah, yeah, I was gonna say, I think that it's this is like very like Hickenlooper-esque like brain going on here. Um, so but the thing that they always say is like, oh well, the federal liberals they passed the No Oil Tanker Act and the Anti Pipeline Act, which were I don't even remember which bills they were. It was like C-69 or something, and another one, which literally just made it that before you use public money for a project, you had to go through like the proper like consultations, and you had to do a risk audit for like the environment and stuff. And I remember the Liberal government buying a pipeline at some point. So, but the thing is, what's kind of amazing about these companies leaving, and the government with its $30 million Canadian Energy Center war room targeting environmentalists and those critical of the great black liquid that dwells within Athabasca. Um, I found this article out of the Financial Post from 2012, actually, so it's rather old, and it's entitled "Majority of Oil Sands Ownership and Profits Are Foreign," says analysis. Um, And it says here that, yeah, more than two-thirds of all oil sands production in Canada is owned by foreign entities, sending a majority of the industry's profits out of the country, says a new analysis released Thursday. This is a long time ago, though, by a British Columbia based conservation group. So, of course, some people are going to say, like, oh, well, forest ethics advocacy. Yeah, they're obviously like this left wing environmentalist conservation group. They're obviously out to destroy Canadian oil and gas. Um, but the thing is that they analyzed a shareholder information report from Bloomberg Professional of more than a dozen companies, including 9 with headquarters in Canada. 71% of ownership in oil sands production was foreign, while the foreign based companies controlled 24.2% of the sector's production.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about this is if you look up the companies themselves, like Suncor or Syncrude, they actually are based in Canada, but it's the investors and the distribution of shares and other things like this that's kind of sneaking in the background. But they do put up a pretty good front, being based most of them in Calgary.
Do you want the numbers actually? So Synovus, 54.7% foreign ownership at the time of this report in 2012. Canadian Oil Sands, 56.8% foreign ownership. Suncor Energy, 56.8% foreign ownership. And actually, that's quite a bit higher now because I seem to remember that there was a buyout of some of their shares by Chinese interests, if I'm not mistaken. I'll have to look into that, but I think it's higher now. Canadian Natural Resources Limited, 58.8% foreign ownership as per the Bloomberg report. Nexen, 69.9% foreign ownership, and actually that is a result of a buyout by the state Chinese oil development company or whatever it's called. Husky Energy, 90.9% foreign ownership.
Wow.
90.9. Unbelievable. Imperial Oil, no surprise that it's 88.9% American Oil Company.
If you go
And you
back
just
to one of our old videos about how Sweden invested in their oil field versus how we just allowed foreign investors in, I think it explains a lot about how we got here.
it does. Royal Dutch Shell, 98.49% foreign ownership makes sense. It's based out of the Netherlands. So you go through all of this shit and you look at it and you go, huh. So if we cut their taxes, and it's clear that their interests are like not even in the country, let alone in the province. And we know between royalty breaks and low corporate tax and low income tax and low land use fees that were under the PC governments at various stages, most notably under Stelmach, I think, was some of the more egregious examples of that kind of wheeling and dealing. Um, they cut these taxes and then they're like, oh, all the money went elsewhere. It's like, guys, the companies are based elsewhere. What were we expecting? Which at which point I don't actually either the UCP are totally cynical and they know what they're doing, or they are just like, oh, but the money birds will come home. And I think it's the former.
Yeah, honestly, I don't know what to make of that because, like, is this all just a technocratic calculation as to, like, oh, we think that this will actually boost our economy and that we actually think this is going to work? Or are they deliberately trying to kneecap post secondary and to give a gift in the form of a corporate tax break to large companies? I mean, that's the question.
Yeah, and so that kind of sums up the economic situation that we're in,
Yeah, I mean, maybe
broadly
one more
speaking.
thing we can just touch on though is in the same vein of the corporate tax cut, essentially a giveaway to corporations. We are also seeing some other kind of fishy things when it comes to the UCP helping out their buddies.
Oh yeah, some classic Allison Redford Sky Palace nonsense. We're gonna
Yeah.
party like it's 2010. All right.
Yeah, and so I don't want to make too much of this right now. I would say if you want to get all the details, NDP Twitter is a great place to read about this. Um, they've been on it. I mean, this is a pretty good thing for them to score points on, so they're going to be, I'm sure, going after it for a while. They even have like a little catchy hashtag around the chartered flights expenses. But we've got the chartered flights issue. We've got the contract about the public inquiry into allegations of foreign funded reputational attacks on Alberta's oil and gas industry. So, the commissioner who's heading that inquiry is handing a nearly $1 million contract to his son's law firm, or at least the law firm in which his son is a partner.
Denton's law firm.
That's correct. Yeah. So you've got those two, the flight and the law contract, and now we've got the nearly $50,000 in travel expenses for Leg, the fellow who traveled to London to work on the same public inquiry. So these are the kind of giveaways we're seeing to people who are close to the UCP.
Wasn't his name? It's like Leg McKnight or something.
I believe Leg is the last name.
McKnight. I don't even. Who gives a shit?
But
Like,
but the fellow
all
who's
that matters
doing
is that he spent public money in a 5-star hotel,
yeah, exactly. I mean, he's
while saying that we gotta tighten our belts and we gotta live within our means. We gotta reduce the deficit. Oh,
I
it's too
I
good.
think it's worth bringing up that while we're tightening our belts, this Leg fellow is going to Chilworth, London, Paddington, and Kettner's in Soho, two of the most expensive and reputable 5-star hotels in the UK.
So while we're all forced to tighten our belts, they are loosening their belts, and it is just all hanging out. It just.
It's looking
Um,
pretty ugly, especially when the premier's chartered flight was to the next province over and they brought their wives. They have drivers. They have cars that are specifically ready to drive them for events like this. It's a drivable
you could
distance.
fly business. You could fly business class, really. I would be almost more okay with that. It'd
Oh
be
yeah,
less
like
expensive.
yeah, of course. I saw tweets going around after this came out of people seeing Rachel Notley in economy class on regular flights, around Canada. So I don't understand where they get the gall. I wonder if they're going to wise up and stop this, or whether we're going to see more of these scandals. Because in my view, the corporate tax giveaway is a big enough scandal already. Maybe these things will just pale in comparison.
Well, one of my friends had a pretty apt comment, and he said that when the UCP formed, and it was a merger of the Wild Rose Party, which is more of like a libertarian, social conservative type, which I don't really understand how those two things go together, but we're gonna roll with it. And then you had the progressive conservatives that were more of this sort of like corporatist, fiscally conservative, yet kind of socially progressive in the way that they never really commented on it. Um, that the combination of these two parties was supposed to be like bringing together the best of both worlds. But I think what we have found is that we just ended up with like just wanton corruption, terrific corporatism, and neoliberal flair, combined with a really insidious social conservative element, including like misogynistic tendencies, nativist tendencies, anti-LGBTQ2S plus sentiments, just the whole rigmarole. And then that's not even, we're not going to touch on it today, but then there's also that conscious bill bullshit that they're trying to push through again. Um, so it's so strange to me because you would think like, will they smarten up? Will they get over it? Or are they just going to bury themselves? I I think that they're honestly just going to bury themselves. It's hard to imagine. Like, bear in mind they
It's hard
got
to
in.
imagine how they're going to justify this in 3 to 4 years.
And the thing to always remember about this current government is they say that they have this great big huge swing and mandate to do what they want to do. But remember, the voter turnout was 61%. They won about 54% of that vote. Yeah, that's a win in that case for sure. Obviously, they are the ruling party, and it's a pretty substantial majority. But 35% of eligible voters voted for the UCP. Less voted for the NDP. That has to be pointed out as well. But to pretend as though they represent the majority of people in this province, other than, there's always a portion of your population in this way that's just too far gone. They're too invested in a given ideology to for things to break through until it comes around to personally affect them. That's never going to change, but to pretend as though this will not have ramifications, there is 65% of this province that did not vote for them that could turn against them at pretty much any time. And if they even just lose Calgary, they lose the next election. And something tells me that those Husky workers that got like the dozens or so that were reported to have been walked out of the headquarters there a few weeks ago, something tells me that that might have an impact.
Not to mention the reduction to municipal spending in Calgary that the mayor is drawing so much attention to.
Oh yeah, we didn't even touch on that. That's also really hideous. The city charter that the Edmonton and Calgary, I think Lethbridge was also a beneficiary of this, signed with the provincial government to receive some of their income tax back so that they could invest it in things like public transit. And then the UCP canceled that. And then they also added a provision where they can just like have veto power over any public works project with no reason and very little notice. We didn't even touch on that, but that is also just oh my like
It's
ugh.
tragic, yeah. And what about the Green Line in Calgary? Like they're saying now that the Green Line, that the proposed rail line, could be in threat of not being able to be complete, or even if it is, being delayed by like half a decade.
Yeah, well that would be pretty common for Alberta construction projects because we have an absolute racket in the way that our public contracts are awarded, but that is a topic for another time.
Exactly. Yeah, I think for an overview, we gave pretty much all the core aspects of the budget that matter to average Albertans.
Yeah, and there's just so much more, and there will be so much more coming down the pipeline. But I'm just glad that I was able to get it off my chest, because not that this podcast should be just used for venting, but that it had just been like eating at me for like weeks now, and kind of putting everything together. And like I said, when you start from the corporate tax cut to the McKinnon panel to the actual budget announcement to now what is now coming out these incredible like blatant self-enrichment and corruption that's occurring. um it's perfect. Just mm, like just tie a little bow on it, put it on top, give it to your child for Christmas, and then watch as they cry their eyes out because you de-index their tuition.
Yeah, I gotta agree. Like, it's so cathartic to get this all in one place and get it all out there. Like, keeping up with it every day is just like kind of infuriating, kind of confusing. It's like I don't know. Some days I don't know what to make of it. Other days it just makes you mad.
I guess that kind of just rounds everything out then. We'll call it there. This has been The Underside of Power with Mark and Sean. Ciao.
See ya.
This is out of our reach.